I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Parliamentary business resumes this week with a couple of key figures making a return to the House of Commons. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole and Bloc Québécois chief Yves-François Blanchet are returning after spending time in COVID-19 isolation. Mr. O'Toole will be making his first comments in the House as Tory leader, and political consultant Ginny Roth says his biggest challenge will be his lack of name recognition among the general public. The Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB, is over. Now it's up to Parliament to approve of a Liberal proposed replacement this week. In its place is employment insurance, which the government says the majority of people will go on, plus a new suite of benefits that won't exist unless approved by the politicians. As of a week ago, the CERB had paid out $79.3 billion to 8.8 million people. The government says the first payment of the new system will come the week of October 11th. HUAWEI senior executive Meng Wanzhou is due in a Vancouver courtroom today for the latest arguments in her extradition case. Meng's defense team will argue the extradition proceedings should be halted because they claim Canada Border Services Agency officers detained and questioned the Chinese national without a lawyer. They also say her electronic devices were seized and that she was compelled to give up the passcodes before her official arrest. Meng was arrested at the city's airport in late 2018 at the request of U.S. authorities who want her extradited to face fraud charges. Ottawa is pressing ahead with plans to buy billions of dollars worth of much-needed equipment for the Canadian Armed Forces. Still, a top procurement official with the Department of National Defence admits that COVID-19 is further slowing down some already delayed purchases. The Defence Department's Troy Crosby says the projects most likely to be delayed are those where physical distancing and other COVID-19 safety measures have been implemented, such as shipbuilding. Montreal immigration lawyer Mariam Haddad is thanking her supporters after her expulsion from the Green Party leadership race was reversed last week, about 18 hours after she appealed the decision. She had been removed from the ballot for allegedly endorsing a rival provincial party in the British Columbia election. Haddad had tweeted an endorsement for the new BC Eco-Socialists Party, not the BC Green Party, in the provincial election. Online voting began on Saturday, with a winner to be announced on October 3rd. New Brunswick is getting set to swear in its new legislator today. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, officials say there will be 4 mini-ceremonies this afternoon with 12 MLAs each. The Progressive Conservatives won a majority in this month's provincial election. The new cabinet will be sworn in tomorrow. Members of Nova Scotia's Sebagan-Nagadi First Nation are expected to meet with Federal Fisheries Minister Bernadette Jordan this week. They'll be discussing what the community's moderate livelihood fishery might look like. The community launched its own independent fishery earlier this month, which is a move that angered non-Indigenous fishermen and led to a flotilla hauling 350 Mi'kmaq traps from the water. Minister Jordan and Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett issued a statement last week that they won't tolerate vigilante action. A group advocating for BC municipalities and some First Nations is calling on the province to share its cannabis excise tax revenue. The Union of BC Municipalities announced that it will seek a portion of the revenue after a nearly unanimous vote by its 189 members at this week's convention. Union calculations suggest that the province is in line for about $50 million in the fiscal 2020-2021 year. The head of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network is criticizing authorities for what he calls police inaction when it comes to harassment against Canadian politicians. Bernie Farber was responding to a video posted to social media showing federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh being verbally accosted by a man in front of Parliament Hill. Mr. Farber said such an interaction only encourages racists and bullies. The Parliamentary Protective Service says it is actively monitoring threats and adjusts its security posture accordingly. The Correctional Service of Canada is suspending visits to federal prisons in Quebec. In light of rising COVID-19 cases, the agency says it will assess the situation on a weekly basis, but for now, the restrictions do not apply to prisons in other provinces. The Correctional Service says there are no active cases of COVID-19 among inmates in its 43 institutions across the country. Canada's 2 most populous provinces continue to struggle with rising COVID-19 case numbers. Both Quebec and Ontario this weekend tallied their highest daily case numbers since May. Canada's top public health official, Dr. Theresa Tam, says Canadians need to remain vigilant, especially where case counts are climbing more rapidly. After the break, this past week on the Forum Daily, I spoke with TIA Health medical expert Dr. Abhishek Raut. We discussed the second wave of COVID-19, the rising numbers that provinces are seeing, and what Canadians can do this fall to prevent another lockdown from happening. It is official. We are in the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada, with the world hitting 1 million cases today. The provinces hit hardest by the second wave continue to be the two most populous provinces in the country, Ontario and Quebec. This prompted Quebec Premier François Legault to impose new restrictions on restaurants, bars, and home gatherings on Monday, which saw 750 new cases in the province. Ontario hit the grim milestone of the highest daily total of cases since the pandemic began yesterday at 700 new cases. According to Ontario Premier Doug Ford, the second wave is likely to be worse than the first, and it is up to Ontarians to decide if they face a wave or a tsunami. This as public health officials are urging health authorities to tighten restrictions again, or hospitals might start to flood again. Although some authorities might be hesitant to introduce a second lockdown, everyone agrees on one thing. It is up to Canadians to manage the severity of the second wave. And to help us out with how to exactly do that, in our TIA Health medical segment, we are joined by Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, always great to have you on the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, cases are rising exponentially right now. What should Canadians do immediately to reduce this wave's trajectory?
Well, you're absolutely right. We're seeing 1 million cases now worldwide and 700 cases in Ontario in a single day. I think what we need to do is treat this the way we treated COVID in March, which was aggressively. What we did was we went immediately to significant hand washing, mask wearing, and social distancing. But over the course of the last few months, you've seen a bit of that COVID fatigue, where those things have been taken a little bit more casually. So I think that renewed vigilance is going to be extremely helpful in controlling this immediately.
Now, although we're not in a second lockdown at the moment, do you think it's a good idea for Canadians to treat this second wave as if we are?
Absolutely. I think that's what really happened in March when we went into that lockdown. Restaurants and a lot of places actually had to shut down, unfortunately, and weren't prepared for a new business model. But now they are. So certainly what you can look at is having a lockdown at home, per se, where you spend a significant amount of time at home. You can still order from your restaurants and you can still do a lot of grocery shopping, but they deliver to you now, and basically treat it as a lockdown, even though it's not one.
Now, let's get into these social circles now. You mentioned COVID fatigue. We have families loosening their social circles. Now that school is in session and families might unwillingly or unknowingly have their social circles expand, what would be your advice for families in terms of social gatherings?
So that's absolutely true. Traditionally, in September, all the way up to Thanksgiving, our social bubbles tend to just expand a little bit more and more and more. And then when Thanksgiving happens, of course, it's the largest bubble. This is what happens every year, and that's why we actually see this wave even with the flu. So my biggest concern here is Thanksgiving. We want to minimize those gatherings as much as possible and keep those social circles very tight and small in order to minimize the spread here.
Let's talk about masking now. Some medical professionals say we might need to mask up more than we think. What would be your advice on this?
I think it's actually a great teaching moment about masking in general. I think what we find is that masking is really important, but masking also means making sure you're not touching your face, making sure you're changing the masks often as well. And it's a great teaching moment for kids as well on what they do with masks. So certainly more masking is definitely much more helpful.
Now, I'm sure Canadians don't want a second lockdown, but we're seeing a lot of bars and social clubs having cases. How can these establishments manage the second wave without having to close down again?
It's a good thought. I think there is a balance here between, politeness to the person in the restaurant and bar, but at the same time maintaining enforcement of the mask etiquette. So my recommendation, a big one, would be really when a person sits in a restaurant and they have to eat, to try to minimize the time that they have the mask removed. So when they're not eating, they're immediately putting that on, as opposed to just keeping it off for the entire time. I think that would be really helpful in the long run.
Now, I know we touched on the flu a bit last week, but let's get back into that conversation. How important is it to get the flu shot this year compared to last year?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. What we're going to see is the flu symptoms being so similar to COVID that it's actually going to cause a mass panic if we don't bring the flu down as much as possible. Not to mention the immunity of a person is going to go down as well if they don't have the flu shot. And so if they get the flu, they're more likely, theoretically, to also get COVID.
All right, Dr. Rao, we've got about 20 seconds left. Christmas season is on the horizon. Do you think Canadians will be able to save the holiday season if they act now?
Fair enough. I don't want to sound too dramatic, but the only people who can save Christmas is all of us. So that's working together, making sure we're following mask etiquette and washing our hands.
All right, Dr. Rao, thanks again for your time today.
Thanks so much.
After the break, we took a look this past week at how Ontario is limiting access to long-term care homes. TC Energy signed a deal with Canadian Indigenous communities, and an OPP report showed an alarming rise in opioid deaths. Stay tuned, everyone. Indigenous communities have been facing an alarming rise in COVID-19 cases during the last few weeks. Dr. Evan Adams, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer of Health at Indigenous Services Canada, says the biggest concern is ensuring that the more than 650 Indigenous communities are ready for further potential outbreaks. He noted that there has already been a cluster of over 30 cases in his own home community on Vancouver Island. The Canada Border Services Agency says the number of passengers arriving at Canadian airports from abroad last week was down by 93% from a year earlier. That's similar to the rest of September and August, but slightly up from spring, when the COVID-19 travel restrictions hammered the industry. Travelers on flights from the U.S. were down by 96%. The numbers come as the International Air Transport Association downgraded its global traffic forecast for 2020 to a two-thirds decline. Visitor access to long-term care homes in COVID-19 hotspots will be restricted starting next week.
We can't let COVID-19 get into these homes. It's absolutely critical. That's why, as of Monday, October the 5th, visitors to long-term care homes in these areas will have to be restricted to staff, essential visitors, and essential caregivers only.
Up to 2 family members or friends of a resident can register to become an essential caregiver who can enter the facilities even during an outbreak. The Premier says the measure is needed to protect the most vulnerable. The Newfoundland and Labrador government says a new report points to an additional 11.1 billion barrels of oil that are still to be found offshore. The numbers come from an offshore assessment released today and led by the Oil and Gas Corporation of Newfoundland and Labrador. The government says the new numbers bump the total known offshore potential to over 63 billion barrels of oil and 224 trillion cubic feet of gas. TC Energy says it has signed a memorandum of understanding with Canadian Indigenous communities that will allow them to get ownership interest in the Keystone XL pipeline project. The Calgary-based company says the deal was signed with Natural Law Energy, which represents 4 First Nations in Alberta and 1 in Saskatchewan. It says a final agreement between TC Energy and Natural Law is expected to be completed in the 4th quarter of 2020. A New Brunswick seafood supplier is being praised for its sustainably minded efforts. Cook Incorporated has been named one of the top 25 seafood suppliers in North America for its work in sustainability and conservation by seafoodsource.com. Vice President of Public Relations Joelle Richardson says the company is dedicated to its relationship with the marine environment and improving ocean health while producing quality seafood. Cook Incorporated says the company's science-based marine practices and commitment to sustainability has afforded it several certifications. On Monday, authorities moved Montreal and Quebec City to the highest COVID-19 alert level, banning private indoor gatherings and shutting bars, cinemas, and restaurant dining rooms for 28 days. Restaurant owners say they have been treated unfairly. Some restaurant owners have spent thousands of dollars on barriers and personal protective equipment, according to Martin Vizina, a spokesman for Quebec's Restaurateur Association. Quebec Premier François Legault has a message for young Quebecers during the pandemic. Legault says those under 30 account for nearly half of new infections. He is asking people in that age bracket to follow the rules and encourage their friends to do so as well. Montreal Public Health says they'll do an awareness campaign for youth. Organizers behind the Terry Fox Run say the annual event has seen an increase of 20% in fundraising this year. That's despite being run virtually because of the pandemic. Terry Fox Foundation spokesperson Martha McClue says more than 80,000 people participated virtually in the run this year. Ms. McClue says people are still registering to fundraise even though the official event is already over. Carleton University is condemning Turkey's detention of one of its PhD candidates. The school says sociology doctoral candidate Cihan Erdal was detained on Friday and is demanding Canadian consular support for the permanent resident of Canada. It says Mr. Erdal has been targeted because he signed a letter in 2014 calling on Turkey to protect a Kurdish town from ISIS attacks. Global Affairs Canada says only that it is aware of the detention and is closely monitoring the case. A new report on opioids by the Ontario Provincial Police says that 1,163 Ontarians died due to opioid-related causes between January and September 2019. OPP Commissioner Thomas Carrick notes that that's a rate of one opioid-related death every 4.7 hours in the province. Since being equipped with naloxone in September 2017, OPP officers have saved 108 lives, according to the report. The OPP say they laid out 102 charges in 2019, a 500% increase over 2018 in an effort to hold drug traffickers responsible. Coming up next on our Week in Review, Prime Minister Trudeau laid out an infrastructure plan this week to invest $10 billion in projects. The Canada Infrastructure Bank plans to invest $10 billion in projects that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau calls a win-win. The investments are expected to create 60,000 jobs while contributing to the fight against climate change. The bank will invest $1.5 billion in agricultural infrastructure in Western Canada, $2.5 billion in clean power projects, and $1.5 billion to buy zero-emission buses. Another $2 billion will be spent to expand access to high-speed internet service across the country. The Conservatives are denouncing the Liberal government's throne speech in a debate in the House of Commons. Leader Erin O'Toole says Canadians are looking for a plan to deal not only with the second wave of COVID-19, but how the government will guide the country towards economic recovery following the pandemic.
Now, we were all working hard. The whole world were responding, Madam Speaker. But Canadians expect their government to also work smart. They expect their government and their Prime Minister and their Health Minister to learn the lessons when they drop the ball in the first round. When the Prime Minister says in March that rapid testing is Canada's priority, we should be rolling out hundreds of thousands of rapid tests today, Madam Speaker.
That's right.
While the speech is a confidence matter that could bring down the government, the New Democrats have pledged to prop up the Liberals in an agreement that increased benefits for workers affected by the pandemic-caused economic downturn. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet says by limiting debate on their new COVID-19 aid package, the Liberal government prevented the opposition parties from doing their job of identifying gaps and making it better. Bill C-4, which includes a new Canada Recovery Benefit, a more flexible and generous employment insurance regime, and a new sick leave benefit, passed unanimously in the early morning hours. Both the Bloc and Conservatives say they voted in favour because Canadians need help as the country faces a second wave of COVID-19. Well, this as both party leaders return to Parliament following their positive COVID-19 tests and self-isolation. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole and Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet are urging all Canadians to follow health guidelines and stay safe. Mr. Blanchet says all Canadians have a responsibility to keep their guard up to protect those who might be at risk of serious illness. Mr. O'Toole made similar comments, noting that both Ontario and Quebec are in a second wave of the pandemic. Health Canada has given the green light to a rapid test for COVID-19, but just when they will arrive is still unclear. The approval comes a day after the federal government announced a deal to buy nearly 8 million of the Abbott Diagnostics ID Now tests, as well as 3,800 of the analyzer units that process the results. But neither the company nor the federal government will be more specific about when the test kits will start arriving, other than the coming weeks. As election campaigning continues, BC Party leader John Horgan says the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed failures in the care of elders, and the NDP's 10-year plan would mean improvements to facilities and their administration. He says workers can also expect fair wages. Liberal leader Andrew Wilkinson says long-term care workers need proper compensation, but adds that he's skeptical of NDP promises that turn out to be more dream than reality. Green leader Sonia Furstenau says the issues facing older people deserve more attention from the government than pledges for programs that tinker around the edges of their needs. Saskatchewan NDP leader Ryan Miley will make an education announcement in Saskatoon today. Leading up to the October 26th election campaign, Mr. Miley had criticized the Saskatchewan Party government's handling of school reopenings during the COVID-19 pandemic. He called it the worst back-to-school plan in the country. Meantime, Saskatchewan Party leader Scott Moe will spend the second full day of the campaign in Regina. A First Nation in southern Cape Breton is set to become the second Indigenous band in the province to launch a self-regulated commercial lobster fishery. The Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs says fishers from the Potlotek First Nation plan to head out on the waters of St. Peter's Bay today. The Assembly says the fishers plan to exercise their inherent right to fish for a moderate livelihood as spelled out in a 1999 Supreme Court of Canada decision. It is currently the off-season for lobster fishing in Nova Scotia. A pair of MPs are stepping out from behind their opposing benches and joining forces in a fight against anti-Semitism. Liberal MP Anthony Housefather and Conservative Marty Morantz are part of a new international task force looking to force web giants to curb the proliferation of anti-Semitic content online. In Canada, advocacy group B'nai B'rith has said anti-Semitic incidents are up overall, with an 11% rise in online harassments that often advocates genocide. All right, I'm Nima Rajan. Thanks for joining us for the Forum Daily Week in Review, and have a great weekend, everyone.